Right, so everyone's been losing their minds over immigration numbers, haven't they? The headlines are screaming, politicians are pointing fingers, and your uncle at Christmas dinner won't shut up about small boats. But here's the thing nobody wants to admit. The actual data tells a completely different story than what you've been fed. Let me break down what's actually happening, and I promise you, by the end of this video, you're going to be questioning everything you thought you knew. So, first off, net immigration, the big scary number everyone obsesses over. It's dropped by 69%. Yeah, you heard that right. 69% down from July 2024 to June 2025. We're talking 204,000 people, which is basically back to pre-COVID levels. But somehow, the media's still acting like the floodgates are wide open. Now, before you start typing angry comments, yes, immigration itself is still at 898,000 people arriving. That's down 31%, by the way. But here's what nobody mentions. Emigration is up. 693,000 people left the UK. 7% increase. So the actual change to the population, much smaller than the scary headlines suggest. But let's talk about what everyone's really worked up about. Small boats, the channel crossings, the dinghies. This is where it gets interesting, because the data completely demolishes the narrative you've been sold. 40,652 people arrived by small boat from January to mid-December 2025. Now, is that a lot? Sure, it's up 16% from the same period in 2024. But here's the crucial bit. Asylum applications overall were 110,000. That means the vast majority of people seeking asylum aren't arriving on small boats. They're coming through other routes, legal routes mostly. And here's the kicker. Returns and deportations are up 11%. 36,457 people were returned or deported. So this idea that nobody ever gets sent back, complete nonsense. But wait, because this is where the government and the media have been playing you like a fiddle. They focus all the attention on small boats because it's visual, it's dramatic, it makes for great footage. Meanwhile, the actual numbers show it's a fraction of overall immigration. Let me put this in perspective. Work visas, study visas, family visas, these are the main drivers of immigration, not refugees in boats, not asylum seekers, the people coming here legally through official channels, with permission. But that doesn't fit the narrative, does it? Can't whip up moral panic about international students or healthcare workers. Now, asylum seekers in hotels. Everyone's furious about this, yeah? Costing taxpayers a fortune, apparently. But here's what they don't tell you. The reason people are stuck in hotels is because the asylum system is completely broken. The backlog is massive. People are waiting months, sometimes years, for initial decisions. If the government actually processed claims efficiently, they wouldn't need to house people for so long. But instead of fixing the system, they'd rather you blame the asylum seekers themselves. And speaking of the asylum system, let's talk about who's actually getting approved. Because if all these people were fake refugees gaming the system, as certain politicians love to claim, then approval rates would be low, right? Wrong. The data shows substantial numbers of people are granted asylum or some form of protection because, and stay with me here, many of them are actually fleeing genuine danger. Now here's something that'll really bake your noodle. The UK isn't even close to having the highest asylum numbers in Europe, not even in the top 5. Germany, France, Spain, they're all dealing with significantly higher numbers relative to population. But you wouldn't know that from British media coverage, would you? Because then you might realize this manufactured crisis isn't quite the existential threat you've been told it is. Let's talk about illegal immigration beyond the boats, because this is where it gets properly mental. The government lumps everything together to inflate numbers and scare you. Overstayed visas, people working without permission, irregular arrivals by air. It all gets thrown in the same bucket as small boat crossings. But these are completely different issues, requiring completely different solutions. And modern slavery. This is the bit that should actually outrage you, but barely gets mentioned. Thousands of people trafficked into the UK, forced into labour, sexual exploitation, servitude. These are victims, not statistics, but the government would rather you focus on small boats than address the organised crime networks facilitating actual slavery on British soil. Here's the uncomfortable truth nobody wants to say out loud. Immigration isn't the problem. The problem is decades of underfunding public services, wage stagnation, the housing crisis, and wealth inequality. But it's much easier for politicians to point at immigrants than fix the actual structural issues in our economy and society. Can't get a doctor's appointment? That's not because of immigration. The NHS has been systematically underfunded and understaffed for years. Can't afford a house? That's not because of immigrants either. Successive governments failed to build adequate housing while allowing property to become an investment commodity. Wages stagnant? Maybe look at corporate profiteering and workers' rights being eroded, not the person serving your coffee who happens to have an accent. But here's where the immigration debate gets properly cynical. Know who benefits most from immigration? Businesses. They get access to labour pools, skills gaps filled, economic growth. Know who bears the costs? Working-class communities that don't have the resources to adapt. And instead of ensuring those communities get proper investment and support, the government just lets them stew in resentment while corporations profit. The data shows net immigration dropping dramatically. It shows the majority of immigration is legal and through official channels. It shows asylum seekers are a small fraction of overall numbers. It shows returns are increasing. But none of that matters when you've got politicians and media outlets invested in keeping you angry and afraid. Look, I'm not saying immigration doesn't create challenges. Of course it does. Integration, resource allocation, cultural adaptation. These are real issues that need thoughtful policy responses. But you can't have thoughtful policy when the entire debate is poisoned by misinformation and manufactured outrage. The truth is, Britain has always been shaped by immigration. Your food, your culture, your NHS, your economy, all built partly on the contributions of people who came from somewhere else. But we've convinced ourselves that this time is different, that these numbers are unprecedented, that we're being invaded. The data says otherwise. So next time someone starts ranting about immigration, ask them what specific numbers they're actually concerned about. Ask them how those numbers compare historically. Ask them about legal versus illegal immigration. Ask them about the economic contributions versus the costs. 9 times out of 10, they won't have answers because they've never actually looked at the data. They've just absorbed the narrative. The real scandal isn't the immigration numbers, it's how those numbers are manipulated and misrepresented to distract you from the actual problems facing this country. It's how rational discussion gets drowned out by hysteria. It's how data becomes meaningless when people have already decided what they want to believe. And here's my challenge to you. Next time you see a headline about immigration, look at the actual figures, compare them to previous years, put them in context, check multiple sources. Because once you start doing that, you'll realize how much of what you've been told is designed to manipulate rather than inform. The numbers are public, the data is available, and it tells a very different story than the one you've been sold. The question is, are you willing to look at it objectively, or would you rather stay comfortable in your outrage? Because at the end of the day, we can either have an evidence-based conversation about immigration policy, or we can keep screaming at each other based on distortions and half-truths. One of those approaches might actually solve problems. The other just makes politicians' jobs easier. Right, that's it from me. If this made you think differently, or even just annoyed you enough to actually check the data yourself, then I've done my job. Stay skeptical, stay rational, and for the love of God, read past the headlines.